Summer 1944. On the Republic, neutral but hit by the blind violence of war, bombs fall. In the previous months, driven by fear and anguish, people arrived. Shocked, women with children in their arms, men bent over by fatigue, old people dragged away from burning cities. They come in the thousands, in the hope that this tiny state, that fortress on the mount, will be able to offer them shelter. San Marino, neutral and defenseless, suddenly becomes a human anthill. Less than 10,000 inhabitants offer 7,000 rations of bread, distributed daily to infinitely more refugees than the resident population. Railway tunnels become dormitories, squares become refuges, and houses become improvised shelters. An intertwining of destinies in what is one of the most dramatic and, at the same time, in a certain sense, the most virtuous pages of the history of the Republic. This is the story of how San Marino, a small state, was able to welcome an immense tragedy. And today we will tell you all about it after our intro. Welcome to the oldest Republic. I'm Carlotta. Come join me in this amazing adventure. Enjoy the episode. During the Second World War, the Republic of San Marino, while remaining neutral, became a shelter for a very large number of people escaping from bombs and advancing armies. The most dramatic moment was the summer of 1944, when the combats were concentrating along the Gothic Line, crossing the provinces of Pesaro, Urbino and Forlì. Thousands of refugees crossed the border of San Marino in the hope of being saved from the violence of war. But between June and September 1944, not even San Marino was safe. The small state became a battlefield between opposing armies and suffered several bombings. The first, and also the most devastating, took place on June 26, 1944. It hit the township of Città, in particular the railway station and the historic centre, and Borgo Maggiore. The damage was heavy, over 60 victims among San Marino citizens and Italian displaced persons. The newspaper La Stampa of June 28, 1944 wrote, "Anglo-American airplanes have harshly bombed the small Republic of San Marino, causing numerous victims among the civilians and significant damage to buildings. The raid against the oldest republic, which is 1,643 years old, and in this conflict has repeatedly reaffirmed its neutrality, is not justified, especially because the turreted summit of the capital is easily identifiable, even in bad weather conditions. Even more serious is the indiscriminate bombardment of San Marino, since women and children who had escaped from the half-destroyed Rimini and found refuge in the hills of the Republic were hit, and buildings housing the sick or injured people were seriously damaged and razed to the ground. The mass inflow of displaced persons in need of shelter, food and basic goods generated a war economy that contributed to the sustenance of the San Marino population, by now almost completely deprived of the possibility of continuing their activities, especially agriculture. In our narrative, we started from the most complex moment, but movements and returns to the Mount Titano, which followed the course of the war operations, had already been recorded. Already from 1940, indeed, with the entry of Italy into the war, many San Marino citizens who emigrated to Italy began to return home. The number increased in October 1942, when bombings began to hit the cities of the north of Italy, the main destinations of San Marino migrants. Young women who had married Italians, enlisted in the army, returned to their families of origin, often with their small children. These women were registered as foreign citizens because, according to the San Marino legislation of the time, they lost their citizenship by origin because they were married to foreigners. Other migrants, instead, were forced to return from France after the German occupation in May 1940. Not only that, the beginning of the war prompted many Italians to leave cities to take refuge in peripheral or rural areas, and even in San Marino many Italians arrived. Due to the intensified bombings of cities in the north-central regions, such as Milan, Genoa, Turin, and Bologna, requested for entry in San Marino increased from October 1942. The San Marino authorities sought to ensure adequate housing, and in October 1943, the government allocated funding to restore homes for displaced persons. From November 1943 to autumn of 1944, the situation began to become really complex. San Marino was invaded by an unprecedented wave of displaced persons. This phenomenon began when the bombings struck Rimini. The inhabitants of the Adriatic city, together with thousands of others already leaving Milan, Turin, Bologna, Genoa, sought shelter in the hinterland, along the Valmarecchia Valley and, above all, within the borders of the small republic. San Marino, which had at the time less than 10,000 inhabitants, housed a flood of people that increased dramatically in a few months. Why? Because air raids intensified. Combats reached the Gothic Line, and Germans had ordered to leave the Adriatic coast. For many people, San Marino became the last hope. The San Marino authorities tried to keep the situation under control. They concluded agreements with Italian neighboring provinces to ensure the distribution of food to the displaced persons and impose price control on renting houses, apartments, and even individual rooms. The government committed to avoid unfair and selfish claims, invoking traditional San Marino hospitality, a virtue that we can now consider a common thread throughout the history of the small state. But cohabitation was not easy. San Marino people and displaced persons shared the precariousness of the shelters, the anguish of the air raids, the hunger, the lack of clothes, and above all, the fear. In January 1944, the Italian consul in San Marino reported to the Italian Ministry of the Interior that the Republic was overflowing of people beyond all measure. Nevertheless, in the following months, arrival increased again. July, August, and September, thousands and thousands of people pressed on the borders of the small state, trying to save themselves. On September 4th, the peak was reached. San Marino hospitality faced a new challenge. Bread production was increased, electric mills with combustion engines were adapted, new offices and commissaries were created to distribute food. Daily rations of bread in less than 2 weeks were increased from 9,000 to 70,000. This is an impressive number, especially for a population of just 10,000 residents, as we have already said. In the end, in order to guarantee everyone at least some food, the government was forced to reduce the individual ration to 50 grams of bread daily for everyone, San Marino citizens and refugees alike. San Marino was no longer just a refuge, it had become a suddenly enlarged community, a small state that had taken on an immense drama well beyond its capabilities. With the interruption of the Rimini-San Marino railway line, devastated by bombings and, by the way, never compensated and rebuilt, the railway tunnels became the beating heart of survival. It was there that thousands of people took refuge. Italian displaced persons, San Marino families, women, children, and the elderly, a diverse, uprooted, and desperate humanity that found shelter where train convoys used to pass. Francesco Balsimelli, a San Marino teacher, moderate political and captain regent in the crucial semester of summer 1944, describes heartbreaking scenes. Thousands of people lying on improvised beds along the tracks, like in an endless lane. During the day, they went to the portals of the tunnels to breathe, perhaps next to the animals that the farmers had brought there to save. Improvised kitchens, giant cooking hobs, a crowd queuing with bowls, cans, anything that could hold a ladle full of soup. A 6 lire voucher was enough, and lire were the currency at the time. But of course, those who had nothing were not left without soup. The numbers are impressive. Only in Tunnel 1, near the capital San Marino Città, there were 500 foreign displaced persons. In Valdragone, a hamlet of Borgo Maggiore township, inside a tunnel of 850 meters long, lived 3,000 people, 2/3 of which from abroad. Serravalle was collapsing. The rains let water seep in. The cold struck mercilessly. At every shelling, the crowd poured into the tunnels. On September 6th, 2 children lost their lives in the mass. A few days later, the fleeing Germans blew up even the power plant, leaving the Republic in the dark. And meanwhile, from the most beaten areas, more refugees were still arriving, crammed with the few things, the animals, in the mud and in the rain. The railway tunnels were no longer enough. Emergency shelters were opened everywhere, under the public arcades, in the convents, in the towers of the medieval walls, even in the cemetery of Montalbo. Some found shelter in the Collegio Belluzzi, which was one of the most prestigious institutions in San Marino, or in the bishop's apartment. Others simply remained outdoors in makeshift camps without any protection. It was an extreme test of endurance for those who arrived, but also for those who welcomed them. Among the thousands of people who found refuge in San Marino during World War II, there were also well-known people destined to leave a mark on Italian history and culture. Just to name a few, the young Sergio Zavoli, future journalist and writer, the parents and sister of Federico Fellini and Alberto Marvelli, a charismatic figure and already committed to collaborating with the San Marino authorities to face the emergencies of those days. But not just individuals found shelter. Italian institutions crossed the border too. The municipality of Rimini moved to Borgo Maggiore an office to manage the needs of its displaced citizens. The hospital of San Fortunato in Covignano moved to the hospital of Misericordia and to the female orphanage, while Credito Italiano settled in Dogana, and the Bank of Italy opened for several months a provisional operational headquarters in the historic center. In this mosaic of lives, stories, and memories, there were also the racially persecuted, Jewish citizens from Rimini, Milan, Modena, Ancona, but also from Austria and other European countries. In San Marino, they found hospitality in private homes, in convents, and in the Collegio Belluzzi. No one denounced them. There were no denunciations or episodes of anti-Semitism, despite the incursions of the Italian fascists. A truly luminous and precious chapter of the history of this small republic. When Rimini was liberated on September 21st, 1944, a slow and gradual return began. But it was only with the end of the war in 1945 that most of the displaced persons left San Marino definitively, allowing the republic to breathe and look forward. The story told today is not just a page of San Marino's history, but a universal story made of fear and courage, of escapes and hospitality, of resistance and humanity. In those dramatic months, San Marino was a physical refuge and a small strip of land into which the hopes of those who had nothing left poured. It welcomed those fleeing the bombs, those seeking shelter from hunger, those in need of protection from racial persecution. San Marino did so amidst 1,000 difficulties, with very limited resources, with a small but extraordinarily generous population. The war has passed, the rubble has been removed. Trains have now stopped running into tunnels that were once shelters, but the memory of that welcome, of that unexpected and sometimes improvised solidarity remains imprinted in the history of the Republic. Because, as often happens in the darkest periods, it is the simplest gestures, a shared bed, a piece of bread, a makeshift shelter, that makes all the difference, and to remind us that even the smallest of the states can write, when necessary, great pages in human history. With the end of the war, our episode today also ends. We'll see you as always in a week. Thank you for listening, and until the next episode, goodbye.